What neuroscience says about heaven and hell, you won't believe this. Lower your voice when you hear this. Not because someone else is listening, but because something inside you already is. There are thoughts the mind avoids not because they are false, but because they feel too close, too familiar, too dangerous to examine for too long. Heaven and hell belong to that category. Not as distant places, not as stories told to control behavior, but as experiences so intimate that your own brain knows exactly how to construct them. And once you understand that, you may never feel completely alone inside your own thoughts again. Neuroscience does not begin with comfort. It begins with a confession. The brain does not show you reality. It edits it. It filters it. It assembles something believable enough for you to survive inside. Every sound you trust, every face you recognize, every moment you call peaceful or terrifying exists only because a silent organ decided it should. You have never experienced the world directly. You have only ever experienced what your mind allowed you to see. And that means something else as well. The most beautiful paradise and the most unbearable torment you can imagine do not need to be invented. They are already possible. Across centuries, civilizations separated by oceans and language have described heaven and hell in eerily similar ways. Light that does not blind. Darkness that presses inward. Love so overwhelming it dissolves identity. Fear so complete it erases hope. These descriptions were written long before brain scanners, neurotransmitters, or neural networks were ever named. And yet when modern neuroscience peers into the brain at its most extreme moments, it finds the same landscapes waiting there, dormant, patient, ready. When people experience states of profound peace, unity, and transcendence, researchers often observe something unexpected. The brain regions responsible for defining the self begin to quiet. The internal narrator fades. The sense of separation dissolves. Time stops behaving normally. Fear cannot survive without a self to protect. Many who enter this state struggle to describe it, not because it is confusing, but because it feels too complete, too familiar, as if they have returned to something they once knew and somehow forgot. Heaven does not announce itself. It feels remembered. But there is another state the brain knows just as well. When fear takes full control, the oldest structures inside you awaken. The amygdala fires relentlessly. Stress hormones flood the body. The mind narrows. Time stretches. Every second feels endless. There is no future, only continuation. Trauma survivors often say the worst moments did not feel like moments at all, but like places they were trapped inside. Hell does not require fire. It requires certainty that there is no exit. This is where the whisper becomes difficult to ignore. If the brain can generate these states so convincingly, so completely, then what exactly separates them from the heaven and hell we have been warned about for centuries? Are they metaphors? Or are they rehearsals? Every emotion you have ever felt has a neural signature. Love is electrical. Terror is chemical. Meaning itself can be mapped to patterns of activity. That does not make them unreal. It makes them unavoidable. While an experience is happening, it is absolute. You can question it afterward, dismiss it, rationalize it, but in the moment it owns you entirely. Heaven and hell, if experienced, are not philosophical ideas. They are total realities. Near-death experiences force this truth into the open. People who come close to dying often report leaving their bodies, entering realms of light or darkness, encountering presences that feel intelligent, reviewing their lives with unbearable clarity, or feeling judgment without words. Some experience overwhelming peace. Others experience crushing fear. What disturbs scientists is not that these experiences happen, but how consistent they are. How structured. How meaningful. As the brain approaches what it perceives as the end, it releases a powerful cascade of chemicals. Endorphins dull pain. Dopamine intensifies imagery. Serotonin reshapes perception. The systems that maintain your identity weaken. And something else takes over. A state of consciousness that feels more real than waking life, more convincing than memory, more certain than belief. People return changed. Not curious. Not unsure. Convinced. And here is the part few people like to sit with. These experiences are often deeply moral. People report reliving moments where they caused harm, not as punishment, but as understanding. They feel what others felt. They see themselves without excuses. Others feel embraced, accepted, forgiven without words. Neuroscience can describe the mechanisms involved, but it cannot explain why the experience feels like truth rather than imagination. Why it feels revealed rather than constructed. The brain is not only a survival machine. It is an accounting system. It tracks intention. It stores unresolved guilt. It remembers what you avoid remembering. Under normal conditions, distraction keeps these processes quiet. Under extreme conditions, there is nowhere left to hide. Some researchers believe hell-like experiences emerge when fear, shame, and regret dominate consciousness without interruption. Heaven-like experiences arise when resistance collapses and meaning floods in. If this is true, then heaven and hell are not imposed upon the mind. They are uncovered when the noise stops. Meditation research deepens the unease. Experienced practitioners can enter states of bliss, unity, and compassion that last for hours or days. Brain scans show quieted fear circuits and heightened coherence across the mind. Many report losing their fear of death entirely. Not because they were promised something, but because they touched it. Heaven, for them, is no longer an idea. It is familiar territory. Yet the opposite state is just as real. Chronic stress, hatred, resentment, and trauma can lock the brain into patterns of suffering so complete that even safety feels threatening. People trapped in these states often say they feel punished by their own thoughts, unable to escape themselves. Hell does not wait patiently at the end of life. It builds slowly, invisibly, reinforced by repetition. So where does this leave belief? Neuroscience does not deny heaven and hell. It does something more unsettling. It suggests the human mind is already equipped to experience realities indistinguishable from them. Whether these states are entirely internal or points of contact with something beyond the brain remains unanswered. But consider one more possibility, spoken only in quiet academic corners. What if the brain does not create these experiences, but tunes into them? A radio does not invent the signal it receives. It only shapes it. Some neuroscientists and philosophers believe consciousness may work the same way, that the brain filters something deeper than itself. If that is true, then heaven and hell may not be fantasies or punishments, but states of alignment. Frequencies of being. If so, then your daily thoughts matter more than you think. Your emotional habits are not neutral. They are practice. They are conditioning. They are preparation for a state of awareness that may one day arrive without warning. The mind is never still. It is always moving. Toward connection or isolation. Toward peace or fear. Toward surrender or resistance. Neuroscience offers no comfort here. Only a quiet warning. The brain becomes what it repeatedly experiences. And so the question remains, whispered rather than asked. If distraction falls away, if the internal noise finally stops, if nothing remains but awareness itself, where will your mind go? What state have you been building in silence? What reality have you rehearsed in private? Because whether heaven and hell are places, states, or something far stranger than either, one truth is difficult to escape. The mind does not dissolve into nothing. It enters something. And when it does, it enters completely. There is a reason silence makes people uncomfortable. In silence, the mind begins to surface what distraction keeps buried. Neuroscience calls this default activity. Ancient traditions called it reckoning. When nothing pulls your attention outward, awareness turns inward, and what it finds is not empty. It is crowded. Memories without language. Emotions without stories. Judgments without voices. The mind begins to show you what it has been holding all along. This is why extreme experiences reveal so much. Sensory deprivation, deep meditation, severe trauma, and moments near death all strip away the noise. The brain loses its usual anchors. Time fractures. Identity thins. And something else steps forward. People often describe this moment not as chaos, but as clarity. A knowing without words. A sense that nothing is hidden anymore. Neuroscientists have observed that when the brain's usual filters weaken, regions that rarely communicate begin to synchronize. Emotion floods cognition. Memory bleeds into perception. Meaning intensifies. This is not a random malfunction. It is an organized shift. The mind enters a state where separation dissolves and consequence becomes impossible to ignore. Some people encounter warmth there. Others encounter terror. What determines which one appears is not fully understood. But patterns emerge. Those who describe peace often speak of acceptance, surrender, and release. Those who describe torment often speak of resistance, fear, and unfinished inner conflict. The experience does not argue. It does not explain. It simply reveals. This is the part most people instinctively turn away from. The possibility that heaven and hell are not rewards or punishments, but mirrors. That consciousness, when stripped of distraction, reflects the shape it has been given over time. Thought by thought. Choice by choice. Habit by habit. The brain is exceptionally good at hiding things from itself. It minimizes guilt. It rationalizes harm. It softens regret. These mechanisms are necessary for daily survival. But they are temporary. Under certain conditions, they fail. And when they do, there is no buffer between awareness and truth. People who undergo intense near-death or transcendental experiences often report a life review that feels instantaneous yet exhaustive. They do not see events as stories. They feel them. From every angle. Including the angles they avoided. Neuroscience can track the memory systems involved, but it cannot explain why the experience feels authoritative, as if it is not being imagined, but disclosed. What unsettles researchers is that these experiences frequently change people permanently. Fear of death fades. Priorities reorder. Compassion increases or despair deepens. The mind does not return to baseline. Something has been seen that cannot be unseen. This permanence suggests something important. The brain is not merely entertaining a fantasy. It is integrating a state of consciousness it recognizes as fundamental. Real. Meditation studies echo this pattern. Long-term practitioners show measurable changes in brain structure and function. Fear responses weaken. Emotional regulation strengthens. The sense of a separate self becomes less rigid. These individuals often describe a quiet joy that does not depend on circumstance. They are not chasing happiness. They are resting in it. Heaven, for them, is not an event. It is a condition. But there is another group rarely discussed with the same reverence. Individuals trapped in chronic stress, resentment, or trauma. Their brains adapt too. Fear circuits remain active. Threat perception never fully shuts down. Even safety feels unfamiliar. These minds are always preparing for harm. Always bracing. Always watching. Hell, in this case, is not dramatic. It is persistent. Neuroscience shows that the brain strengthens what it rehearses. Repeated thoughts carve pathways. Repeated emotions lower thresholds. Over time, states become traits. This is not metaphor. It is biology. And this is where the whisper becomes unmistakable. If the brain becomes what it repeatedly experiences, then heaven and hell are not sudden judgments. They are trajectories. Directions. Gradual alignments that feel inevitable only at the end. Some philosophers argue that consciousness itself may not originate in the brain, but pass through it. That the brain shapes awareness the way a lens shapes light. If that is true, then death would not create a new experience. It would remove a filter. It would amplify whatever state consciousness has been tuned to. This idea frightens people not because it sounds supernatural, but because it sounds earned. No gatekeeper. No courtroom. No external sentence. Only continuity. Neuroscience cannot confirm this. But it cannot dismiss it either. It can only point to the evidence that the mind does not reset itself easily. It carries momentum. Patterns persist. States linger. Which brings us back to the quiet question most people avoid. Not, what happens after death, but, what state am I cultivating now? Not in public. Not in belief, but in private. In the moments no one sees. In the thoughts that repeat when nothing interrupts them. Because if the mind enters something when the noise finally stops, it will not be unfamiliar. It will feel known. Practiced. Lived in. Heaven and hell may not be destinations. They may be recognitions. And the most unsettling part is this. Neuroscience does not suggest you suddenly become something else at the end. It suggests you become more fully what you already are. Stripped of distraction. Stripped of defense. Stripped of escape. Only awareness remains. And awareness, once alone with itself, does not negotiate. It reveals. There is something the brain does when it can no longer distract itself. It begins to listen. Not to sounds, but to undercurrents. To the emotional residue left behind by years of thinking, choosing, avoiding. Neuroscience has a term for this latent activity, but the term is clinical and clean. The experience is not. It feels like being watched from the inside. Most people never reach this point because modern life is engineered to prevent it. Noise, urgency, endless stimulation keep awareness outward-facing. But when the noise thins, during sleepless nights, moments of grief, isolation, or sudden stillness, the mind drifts inward, and something begins to surface. Not thoughts exactly. More like atmospheres. Moods without stories. Truths without sentences. This is why silence can feel heavy. Brain imaging shows that when external input decreases, internal networks intensify. Memory, emotion, and self-evaluation begin speaking to one another without interruption. The mind starts connecting dots it usually keeps apart. This is not a malfunction. It is a default. A return. People who have brushed against extreme states often say the same thing in different words. I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Not because someone forced honesty, but because there was nowhere left to hide. No narrative strong enough to override what was felt directly. This is where the idea of judgment becomes difficult to dismiss. Not judgment as punishment, but as exposure. The sudden inability to edit oneself. Neuroscience shows that the brain maintains a running model of the self, who you believe you are, who you fear you are, and who you actually behave as. Most of the time, these versions are kept politely apart. Under certain conditions, they collapse into one. When that happens, the experience can feel devastating or liberating, depending on what remains. People who report hell-like states often describe overwhelming regret, not imposed from outside, but generated internally with unbearable clarity. They do not hear accusations. They know. The knowledge presses inward. It does not shout. It suffocates. Those who report heaven-like states describe the opposite. A release from internal conflict. A sense that nothing needs defending. A quiet acceptance that feels undeserved yet complete. Not excitement. Relief. What disturbs researchers is that these states feel final while they are happening. Not endless in duration, but absolute in presence. The mind does not imagine an exit because the state consumes the entire field of awareness. Hell feels inescapable not because it is infinite, but because the concept of elsewhere disappears. Heaven feels eternal for the same reason. Time perception collapses when the brain's prediction systems disengage. Past and future lose their grip. Only now remains. And now feels permanent. This is why extreme suffering and extreme bliss are both described as timeless. Neuroscience can explain the mechanism, but not the meaning. And meaning is what people carry back with them. Some return changed in quiet ways. Others return shaken. Some cannot speak about it at all without their voices breaking. The experience does not behave like a dream. It behaves like a memory of something foundational. This raises a question that lingers uncomfortably in the background of modern science. Why does the brain seem so prepared for these states? Why do the pathways exist at all? Why is the architecture already there? Evolution explains survival. It explains fear. It explains pleasure. But it struggles with transcendence. It struggles with experiences that offer no clear reproductive advantage yet dominate human history, religion, and art with obsessive consistency. Heaven and hell appear again and again not because cultures copied each other, but because the mind keeps finding the same rooms when pushed far enough. And rooms imply structure. Some neuroscientists quietly admit that consciousness behaves less like a byproduct and more like a landscape. A terrain the brain navigates rather than invents. In this view, ordinary waking life is only one region. Extreme states open access to others. Not imaginary ones. Consistent ones. If this is true, then the brain is less an author and more a gatekeeper. And gatekeepers can fail. At death, anesthesia, deep meditation, or neurological collapse, the gates weaken. Filters drop. The question is not what appears, but what you arrive carrying. This idea unsettles because it removes the comfort of sudden transformation. It suggests continuity. That the state you enter may not be new, only intensified. Neuroscience shows that emotional patterns are sticky. Fear strengthens fear. Compassion strengthens compassion. Attention strengthens whatever it rests upon. Over years, the brain becomes biased towards certain states. It returns to them easily. Effortlessly. So when people speak of salvation, liberation, or damnation, neuroscience hears something else beneath the language. Direction. Orientation. Momentum. Not a verdict. A vector. And vectors do not stop abruptly. Which brings us back, again, to the quiet space between thoughts. The place you visit briefly when nothing demands your attention. The mood that surfaces when you are alone long enough. The tone of your inner world when no one is watching. That tone matters. Because if awareness one day finds itself without anchors, without time, without identity, without distraction, it will not invent a new state. It will settle into the one it knows best. This is not threat. It is observation. Heaven and hell may not be assigned. They may be revealed. And revelation does not negotiate. It does not argue. It does not soften itself for comfort. It simply shows what is. And once shown, it cannot be unseen. There is a moment most people recognize but rarely speak about. It happens late at night, when the world is quiet enough that your thoughts stop performing. The mind, deprived of audience, drops its mask. What remains is not dialogue, but atmosphere. A feeling tone that has been accumulating unnoticed. Neuroscience can measure the activity, but it cannot translate the sensation. It feels like standing in a room you have been furnishing for years without ever turning on the light. When the light finally comes on, some people are surprised by warmth. Others discover clutter. Some find locked doors they do not remember building. The brain does not forget. It deprioritizes. It postpones. It buries. But under certain conditions, fatigue, grief, stillness, proximity to death, those priorities reorder themselves. What was background becomes foreground. What was avoided becomes unavoidable. This is why people sometimes break down without knowing why. The emotion arrives fully formed, without explanation, as if summoned. Neuroscience shows that long before the conscious mind understands, the emotional brain has already decided. Awareness is always late to the verdict. In extreme states, this delay disappears. Thought and feeling collapse into one. There is no commentary, only knowing. And knowing, when unfiltered, can feel merciless. People who describe hell-like experiences often say something unsettlingly similar. There was no voice judging me. I judged myself. Not through words, but through direct perception. They felt the weight of their actions, not as stories, but as states. Not punishment. Recognition. This distinction matters. Punishment implies an external authority. Recognition implies inevitability. Heaven-like experiences mirror this in reverse. People speak of acceptance so complete it feels undeserved. Of being known without being condemned. Of relief so profound it dissolves the need to explain oneself. The brain, in these moments, shows patterns of reduced self-referential activity. The one who would defend, justify, or resist is no longer present. No self. No conflict. Neuroscience cannot tell us whether these experiences originate entirely within the brain or pass through it. But it does reveal something uncomfortable. The brain is not neutral ground. It leans. This is why transformation is described, across traditions, not as belief but as practice. As training attention. As reshaping the inner climate. Neuroscience would agree, quietly. Plasticity does not care what you believe. It responds to what you repeat. Fear practice becomes reflex. Compassion practice becomes default. Resentment practice becomes residence. The mind becomes what it rehearses when nothing interrupts it. So when people ask whether heaven and hell are real, neuroscience offers a response that sounds less like doctrine and more like warning. Reality is not only external. It is experiential. And experience, when total, defines reality completely. At the edge of consciousness, there is no argument. No comparison. No escape into distraction. Whatever state arises fills the entire horizon. This is why people who touch these states struggle to describe them. Language assumes distance. These experiences allow none. They are not observed. They are inhabited. Which leads to a final, quiet consideration that science does not dismiss, but refuses to romanticize. If consciousness continues in any form beyond the collapse of the brain, it will not suddenly acquire a new character. It will not be granted a personality transplant. It will carry momentum. Even materialist neuroscience accepts this within life. The mind does not reset overnight. Patterns persist. Tendencies endure. States bleed into states. So if continuity exists beyond the filters of the brain, then whatever remains will not be unfamiliar. It will feel like home. Or like confinement. Not because it was assigned, but because it was prepared. This is why the idea of judgment has always felt less like a trial and more like a mirror. Why the most terrifying accounts contain no torturer, only awareness. Why the most blissful accounts contain no reward, only release. Nothing added. Nothing taken away. Only revealed. The mind, alone with itself, becomes undeniable. And perhaps that is the reason these ideas have survived every era, every culture, every scientific revolution. Not because they describe geography, but because they describe psychology pushed to its limit. Consciousness without concealment. When the last distraction falls away. When the last story collapses. When the last defense dissolves. There is only one thing left. Awareness, encountering itself. And in that encounter, there is no negotiation. Only truth. There is a reason people instinctively fear being alone with their thoughts for too long. Not boredom. Not silence. Exposure. When the mind runs out of material to distract itself, it does not stop working. It turns inward. And inward is not empty. It is layered. Dense. Accumulated. Neuroscience shows that the brain is always running background processes, evaluations, emotional appraisals, unresolved simulations of the past and future. Most of the time, consciousness schemes the surface. But when stillness deepens, awareness sinks. And what it touches there does not ask permission to be felt. This is when people describe a strange pressure. Not physical. Psychological. As if something is approaching, or emerging, or becoming unavoidable. There is no image yet. No story. Just a sense that something has been waiting. The mind does not experience this as new. It experiences it as familiar. That familiarity is the most unsettling part. Because it suggests that whatever rises in deep awareness was not created in that moment. It was already there, shaped slowly, patiently, by years of unnoticed repetition. Thoughts you returned to when no one corrected you. Emotions you justified instead of questioned. Judgments you rehearsed silently until they felt natural. The brain does not distinguish between public and private behavior. It strengthens whatever is practiced. Even when no one sees. This is why moral injury leaves deeper scars than physical pain. Neuroscience shows that violating one's own values activates the same circuits as physical threat. The body responds as if something essential has been endangered. Over time, these unresolved signals do not fade. They sink. And what sinks eventually surfaces. In extreme states, there is no buffering mechanism left to soften the impact. The mind encounters itself directly. Without commentary. Without context. Without excuses. People who enter hell-like states often describe a crushing intimacy with their own awareness. Not fear of something attacking them, but fear of being unable to escape themselves. The suffering comes not from fire or punishment, but from total exposure. From seeing without distortion. This is why language fails. Because language implies distance. These experiences allow none. Those who enter heaven-like states describe the same intimacy, but without resistance. Awareness meets itself and finds no conflict. No fracture. No need to defend. The relief is not excitement. It is silence inside. Neuroscience observes this as decreased activity in self-monitoring networks. The watcher dissolves. And without a watcher, there is nothing to judge. No guilt. No shame. No fear. Just presence. Which means the difference between heaven and hell may not be external conditions at all, but internal alignment. Whether awareness meets itself as enemy or as home. This idea terrifies people because it removes randomness. It removes the fantasy of last-minute transformation. It suggests that the inner world is not erased at the edge of consciousness, but amplified. Neuroscience cannot tell us what happens after death. But it tells us something equally unsettling about before it. That the mind is always preparing for its own stillness. Training itself, quietly, for what happens when nothing else remains to focus on. Every time you sit in silence and immediately reach for distraction, the brain learns something. Every time you sit and stay, it learns something else. These lessons accumulate. This is why ancient practices emphasized watchfulness. Not belief. Awareness. Attention. Because what you attend to becomes familiar. And familiarity becomes default. Defaults matter when there is no time to choose. At the edge of consciousness, choice disappears. There is only continuation. The state you fall into is the one that has gravity. And gravity does not ask what you intended. It pulls. So when people speak of salvation or damnation, neuroscience hears momentum. Direction. The gradual shaping of awareness toward ease or friction. Toward coherence or fragmentation. Heaven and hell may not be destinations reached by a decision. They may be the inevitable result of thousands of unnoticed ones. This does not mean perfection is required. The brain is not a moral accountant tallying points. It is a pattern recognition system. It cares only about what repeats. What dominates. What becomes familiar. And familiarity is powerful. Because when everything else dissolves, familiarity remains. When identity thins. When memory loosens. When time collapses. Awareness settles where it knows how to be. The most unsettling thought is not that heaven and hell might exist. It is that they might already be forming. Quietly. Patiently. Without ceremony. Inside the mind you live in every day. And when the final stillness arrives, the mind will not ask what you believed. It will reveal what you practiced. And in that revelation, there will be no argument. Only recognition. And so we arrive at the place where explanations fail. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because saying more would soften what must remain sharp. If everything you've heard is true even in part, then heaven and hell are not distant threats or distant promises. They are directions. Quiet ones. Chosen slowly. Reinforced. Invisibly. Built in the privacy of thought, emotion, attention, and habit. Neuroscience does not accuse you. It does not absolve you. It simply observes. The mind becomes familiar with what it repeats. And familiarity becomes home. When distraction ends, whether through stillness, exhaustion, or the final silence no one escapes, awareness does not disappear. It remains. And it does not float. It settles. It settles where it has learned how to be. There is no sudden transformation. No dramatic verdict. No external voice announcing judgment. Only clarity. And clarity, when total, is irreversible. This is the part people sense but rarely face. That the most important work is not done in moments of crisis, belief, or declaration, but in the quiet hours no one witnesses. In the tone of your inner world. In the way you relate to your own thoughts. In what you return to when nothing forces you elsewhere. This is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to awaken you. Because responsibility is not punishment. It is power. If the mind can descend into hell-like suffering through fear, resentment, and resistance, then it can also rise into peace through awareness, compassion, and release. Neuroscience confirms what ancient wisdom whispered long ago. Attention is formative. Repetition is destiny. Awareness is not passive. So the question that remains is not what you believe about heaven or hell. It is this. What state are you practicing becoming? And now, pause. Feel the silence beneath the words. That silence is not empty. It is potential. You are not being judged by it. You are being invited. If this reflection stirred something in you, fear, curiosity, calm, or clarity, let it matter. Let it be useful. Let it guide you gently, not harshly, toward a more conscious way of living with your own mind. If you found value here, if this journey helped you see yourself or reality a little more clearly, take a moment to support this space. Like this video so it can reach others who are quietly searching. Share it with someone who feels restless but doesn't know why. And subscribe, so we can continue exploring these deeper questions together, slowly, honestly, without noise. This channel exists not to frighten, but to awaken. Not to judge, but to understand. Not to give answers, but to help you listen more carefully to your own awareness. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for your stillness. Take what you've learned gently. Let it make you wiser, calmer, and more compassionate, especially with yourself. And when the noise returns, as it always does, remember this silence. It's still there.